Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. This is the first Women, Leadership and Sustainability in Critical Times meeting. I think I should say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to whoever is joining us from different time zones in this kind of transnational digital space today. I wish to welcome our invited speakers, Jutta, Gutberlet and Anita Gurumurthy, and all the colleagues and partners that have actually worked to make this happen. For me, it is a pleasure and an honor to open this meeting in my role as director of the Elena Cornaro Center for Gender Studies of the University of Padua. The aim of this center is to promote research and training in a gender perspective, from a gendered perspective also, through an intersectional and transdisciplinary approach, which puts together many different disciplines from the social, political, and humanistic knowledges, the hard sciences, technology, medicine, particularly as regards the gender-specific aspects of medicine. We are hosting as a center this event as part of a larger series of initiatives that are located at the intersection between the local and the global, that the center has devised and is actually organizing as both its own internal reflection and a shared dialogue with a wide network of actors and stakeholders, as is already visible, I would say, in the collaborative effort of this meeting. So today we begin by addressing issues of gender inequalities in the guidance of societies that we believe require new lenses, new practices, also new words, if we want to produce real change. So we will be talking about the commitments that have not yet been made. We will be talking about the very real risk of wasting or nullifying recent improvements regarding gender equality and inclusive societies, and about the role of the scientific as well as practical knowledge in addressing major challenges, starting from an understanding of the kind of dynamics that the current pandemic has set into place. This is a quite large task. We're just beginning today, and we hope it is a fruitful conversation. I'm speaking, and we are streaming from one of the beautiful rooms of Palazzo Bo, which is the seat of the rectorate of the University of Padua. And I'm in very good company, because sitting here with me at due distance around the large table are my colleague, Claudia Padovani, is actually sitting in a different table in the next room, and Claudia is co-hosting this meeting, and the rector of our university, Professor Rosario Rizzuto, who has kindly joined us for this global conversation, and I'm actually inviting to say a few words of welcome, Professor Rizzuto.
I'm really glad that the very first webinar that comes out of the lockdown is on women, leadership and sustainability. 3 key words to rebuild societies and the planet for the future. So thank you to all of you. I understand that someone is in the morning, someone is in the night. So we are really looking at the entire planet. And thank you for being with us in Centro Elena Cornaro and share views, discussion, and also indication of what the period has been and your views for the future are. So thank you again and welcome to the University of Padua.
Thank you, Rector. Now I'm inviting Claudia Padovani to join in with her own introductory remarks.
Thank you, Annalisa. I'm really pleased that we're actually starting the series of conversation, and here I'm speaking on behalf of the Department of Politics, Law and International Studies, and in particular of the master level degree in European and Global Studies and the research group Next Generation Global Studies within the department. This event is part of a project of innovative teaching, whereby we encourage encounters between our students and colleagues and international guests from different regions, sectors, and walks of life to address issues of relevance to their educational multivocal through the format of the conversation. Because we believe that the practice of entering into dialogues across boundaries can enrich our academic experience and provide models for sustainable collaborations. In this case, for today, the collaboration is with the local foundation, Fondazione Fontana, which operates in the Padua territory since 1998. It carries out relevant projects on global citizenship, involving schools, teachers, students, and proposing new ways of understanding global issues. These kind of partnerships are meaningful ways to realize the third mission of the university alongside teaching and research. And we try to do so by linking our awareness of the global as the condition within which we live, work, and communicate with local practices, local situations, and experiences. This is all the more relevant in current times of global crisis, when global efforts are needed to think together and share and to develop visions for the future. The invitation to this event has been widely circulated, and I'm pleased to see that we have participants from different countries attending the meeting. We hope this may be the beginning of a longer and wider conversation around crucial issues of gender relations in our societies, inequality and fundamental rights, and the future we want to help shaping. After a brief introduction of the panelists, we shall pose questions to our guests so that we can have an informal conversation. Some of the questions have been elaborated by students who participated in a school project promoted by Fondazione Fontana and the World Social Agenda, of which Sarah Bean will speak briefly in a moment. And in the end, we shall open the floor for questions and answers. So I'm now giving the floor for a brief welcome to Sarah Bean from Fondazione Fontana.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to everybody. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with you, with all our students and all the staff of World Social Agenda. What I can say briefly, thank you, Claudia, for the brief presentation. Fontana Foundation is really engaged since 20 years in global citizenship education in primary and secondary schools in Padua, especially in Padua. Every year we work with 5,000 students and 100 teachers with a program called World Social Agenda, based on the Agenda 2030. Today, we are here with a group of students from high schools of Padua. They represent 5 classes, more or less 350 students that in this school year studied, reflected, analyzed through fieldwork and interviews the topic of SDG 5 of the Agenda 2030, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. The main goal of the project is growing critical awareness of the importance of building an inclusive society, all that by the maintenance of differences, especially gender differences, as opportunities, not as obstacles that need to be removed. Students investigated stereotypes linked to gender issues inside the families, in school, in their free time, in sport activities, and so on. In a word, we can say in everyday life experiences. And as good researchers, after a long year of work, they still have a lot of questions. And they are here to try to find out some answer from you and from this special guest we have with us. So our grateful thanks to the University of Padua, to the Cornaro Center for Gender Studies, to the international guests, Jutta and Anita, the students, the teachers, and all the staff of World Social Agenda and Fondazione Fontana are really proud to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Also, thanks to your students and the students that have collaborated in the past months to come to this meeting today. Okay, my turn now to welcome at least one of our invited guests, and Claudia will follow. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jutta Gutberlet, who is currently a professor in the Department of Geography at University of Victoria in Canada. Jutta is originally from Germany, but has spent a long time studying and working in Brazil before moving to Canada. And she indeed spans a large geography of personal, scientific, social, and political commitment. Her research addresses topics such as sustainability and governance in resource management, poverty reduction, food security and food sovereignty, livelihoods and resilient communities. And in her research work, she applies a situated urban political ecology framework, which helps understand the political, economic processes, the power relations, as well as material and discursive conflicts that shape current forms of uneven development. We are greatly interested in her work, which is collaborative, action-oriented, community-based, and also made accessible to the general public through different communication forms. She has videos, websites, pamphlets, booklets, banners. So she's also communicating her work in a wide way. And last but not least, Jutta sits in the International Scientific Committee of our Elena Cornaro Center in Padua, which makes her presence here today doubly welcome. So thank you for being here, Jutta, and thank you for wanting to join us in this new adventure. Now, I give the word to Claudia, who introduces Anita Gurumurthy.
It is my pleasure and honor to introduce a colleague in research and friend, Anita Gurumurthy, who is a founding member and executive director of IT for Change, an NGO that is based in Bangalore in India, an NGO that works towards a society in which digital technologies can contribute to human rights, to social justice and equity. At IT for Change, Anita leads research collaborations and projects in relation to the network society with a focus on governance, democracy and gender justice. And her work reflects an interest in Southern frameworks and the political economy of internet governance and data and surveillance. Anita engages actively with policymakers, practitioners, social movement activists, and the academic community to expand and deepen conversations on the public policy imperatives of the intertwining of the digital in all spheres of life. She has contributed regularly to policy-related processes in several global arenas. She has represented civil society position in different global events, including the Internet Governance Forum and other venues where we actually shared some of the concern. But at the same time, Anita directs and draws inspiration from the work of Prakriye, IT for Change's field center that works with grassroots rural communities on technology for social change models towards promoting women's and girls' leadership and digital capabilities. So it is a pleasure and honor, Anita, to have you with us this evening in this context. Now I think we can actually start the conversation. The conversation will be informal with questions that Annalisa, myself, and then students will pose and answers that we are very eager to hear from our guests.
So here our conversation begins, and I would like to introduce this conversation by situating our thinking together today in a space that may serve as a common starting point. And I'm invoking here the widely accepted notion or practice also in feminist epistemology of seeing knowledge as an interplay of situated knowledges in the plural. That is the idea that all forms of knowledge reveal the particular conditions in which they are produced and somehow reflect the social identities and locations of the knowledge producers. And this, I suggest, should ground our dialogue, our reflection today. And I propose that the situation that is shaping our thinking now in Padua is Italy and COVID, or Italy in COVID times, as the rector stressed, and that what the people that we are bringing together today on this platform, what they share is the COVID crisis, which concerns every aspect of the life of people in every corner of the planet. But the key word I want to introduce here is not COVID, but crisis. A crisis that the pandemic has evidenced and which I would like to grapple with by going back to the primary etymological meaning of the word crisis or krisis in ancient Greek. And crisis means choice, means decision, a decisive phase that require momentous intervention and vision. In other words, crisis is a moment for important decisions to be made. And more than ever before, this crisis requires, I believe, opening up a public space of discourse, cultural, scientific, political, and so on, where new questions are posed, urgent issues are addressed, and fresh answers hopefully provided. For example, what this crisis has certainly made visible is our human, our social, our environmental fragility. It has evidence that the life of people and the life of the planet are one and the same thing, and that collective health depends on actions to protect the ecosystem. And that, of course, reminds me that today is the 5th of June and it is World Environment Day. So other discourses are going on at the same time as we speak here today. And this should tell us, as does the work of many women who have promoted social change through environmental struggles, like, for example, Rachel Carson, the young Greta Thunberg, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the States. This should tell us that it is a serious mistake not to consider oneself dependent, entangled, and multiply responsible, particularly as regards issue of environmental and social sustainability and environmental and social justice. So I come to the question now. I would like to ask Anita and Jutta, what, in your experience as women, scholars, activists, are the questions that this crisis poses? What are the missing questions? And what are the deep questions that should be asked and are not being asked?
I think that this is a very useful interpretation, the etymology of the word crisis. And I thought of three different things. And of course, in understanding the questions that the crisis poses, there are innumerable questions, right? The crisis didn't just happen. It's part of the historical continuity of things. The first thing I thought of is the connection between bodies and the body politic. So we've actually seen decades of the marketization of society and the hollowing out of the public everywhere. And, this has been written about in journalistic writing, academic writing, about how public institutions have really decayed and have been made to decay. So we've compared, for instance, why in certain contexts, political ideologies notwithstanding, this has happened, why public trust is low, why is Spain different from Italy, why is Taiwan different from Singapore, or for instance, in my country, why is the state of Kerala, which has had a long-standing communist government, why is that different from the rest of the country? So these questions have come and gone. But one thing we've learned is that public investments in creating good institutions has really served people at this moment. But we've also seen the social contract gone wrong in very, very deep ways, a complete apathy of the system in many places, and a total breakdown of trust. We've also seen how authoritarian capitalism has been the default ideology in the way in which emergency relief rehabilitation has actually happened in many of our countries. So there is this masculine rhetoric of war against the virus, and people have stepped in. And just as philosophers and feminists have pointed out, Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe writes about necropolitics, how social and political power determine who must die so that others can live. So at this moment, we've actually seen how some bodies are dispensable, disposable, and the elites have then been able to preserve their power. This, of course, is not new, and I like to underline that again. And the past decade has actually seen an acceleration of elite class interests, leading to a new neoliberal globalism, and the crisis has just amplified it. We've seen during this crisis in many countries how e-commerce companies have stepped in to fill the vacuum. They've said, we will offer essential services. Bailouts have been, governments have announced bailouts, and these bailouts are for bigger companies. Oftentimes they have, like in the case of my country, changed definitions of what is a small enterprise. They've actually upped the ceiling so that big capital can get the bailout, And some connections between body and body politic have been explored, but not everything. For example, an important thing that has not been explored at all is the complete invisibilization of women's reproductive and sexual health needs. So in no country, I think, in absolutely very, very few countries, if at all, reproductive health services were listed as essential services. At least in my country, it was not listed as an essential service. And that's how deep the pathology of authoritarian capitalism actually runs. We would like to believe that women do not get pregnant, women do not need hospitals, and women do not have deliveries. The second we're going to see is the impacts of hunger. In my country, millions have gone hungry, and hunger has a very, very different way to kill. Hunger doesn't kill instantly. Hunger kills over months and years. And so many women who will survive the pandemic in developing countries will starve, and their health will give up slowly and steadily. The second question I wanted to talk about is the nature of 21st century fascism. 21st century fascism is very different because it's, in some ways, it's feudalist. It's neo-feudalist in its overtones, and the role that many leaders are playing today in many countries, using technologies, using the surveillance apparatus that technologies gives them, particularly male leaders, suggests a complete subversion of the public and public sphere. They've been using the pandemic as a moment to dismantle institutions and to dismantle constitutional ethics. In many parts of the world, the legitimacy to intervene in the so-called public interest has been subverted to redefine governance itself as supra-political and supra-social. So you can just do anything in the name of, rescuing people from the pandemic. Part of this problem is also visible in the near-complete collapse of multilateralism. I recall 2 months ago, President Trump declared that he will, some European country was talking about the vaccine, and he said, we will buy rights to the vaccine for the American people, as if the rest of the world could afford to, collapse and America would still survive. Then, of course, he withdrew support for the WHO, and we have seen the WHO itself being caught in the US-China politics. And this, for me, is a question that Brazilian feminists like Sonia Correa have referred to as a trend of de-democratization. So this is a kind of a neo-feudal fascism in which there is active use of electoral legitimacy to delegitimize constitutionalism or the place of norms in society. So you end up with a certain raw power in the form of masculine authority. And the last thing I want to talk about very quickly in the context of questions and the silences is the collapse of the very space of the public for women. We've heard, of course, of the shadow pandemic of domestic violence everywhere in the world. And my political friends in China point to a huge surge in divorce applications in the months of April and May. Applications have more than doubled, and they reflect pressures on households. But the public space is equally fraught because authorities in China have been censoring every feminist writer from mainland China from reproducing stories and narratives of families and women who sought to record the experiences of deaths, especially coming from Wuhan city. In India, where I come from, women who are leading struggles, till the month of February and March, the streets were replete with a kind of a democratic revolution in the country, with women from the margins taking over the streets, demanding that their citizenship rights be respected. We were going through a moment when our campuses were recording a lot of protests. But once the pandemic hit, we saw the state hitting back, and how state autocracy is going to be dealt with after the pandemic is a very big question. Today, women have been pushed back to the domestic sphere with huge care responsibilities, and many of them from the margins must find a way to reclaim public space. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to listening to Jutta.
My comments regarding that question go in a similar direction, and I would say that the key question which we need to pose is how can we make sure that vulnerable populations are not disproportionately affected in crisis situations? Because that is exactly what we're seeing now in this pandemic, that vulnerable population, be it those who work in the informal sector, be it those who live in substandard neighborhoods where there is no running water and no facilities and infrastructure to protect themselves from getting infected. So these questions, they are not being asked when, for example, governments pose a top-down lockdown in those neighborhoods. And we have seen that in Kenya, for example, but also in India, in many places. The lockdown, what has happened was a mass exodus out of those neighborhoods which seem dead-end places where there is no food, there is no way of protecting the population, and also no way of making income and survive. So I think that's a key question. How will vulnerable populations be affected by crisis? And now we're talking about the COVID-19 crisis, but this crisis actually has uncovered many other crises as well. I think just looking at food production, food delivery, and all the missing links and issues related to mass food production, which in situations of crisis does not even reach the population. So I think through this crisis, we have uncovered also the environmental crisis. I think there's a lot of talk right now about our humans' impact in terms of deforestation, and with those strong impacts, the acceleration of the spread of new viruses and affecting populations. So we need to ask, how can we engage those who do not have a voice or who are invisible in the conversations about needed societal transformations? Maybe in this crisis we have seen some opportunities for marginal voices to be heard. And I'm speaking mostly from my experience of working with waste pickers. Through the project Waste Governance, we are communicating with waste picker leaders and colleagues in different countries in Africa and South America. And from them, we have heard and have participated as well in conversations, groups which have been organized through WhatsApp, for example, or webinars where those voices are coming out. However, those who are accountable and responsible, our governments and decision makers, these are, in most cases, these people are absent. And I mean, we need to shift, we need to have political transformations are essential for a more equitable and just society. And maybe another important question to be posed, and I hear it in some forums as well, is how can we transfer lessons learned from this health crisis to other challenges such as climate change? Because climate change is on the agenda for decades and the significant steps have not been done. While with the corona crisis, we have seen that the whole world can be mobilized in a relatively short time period. So what can we learn if we need mobilize for transformation? And also, what needs to be done for the positive change which we have seen coming out of this crisis? I mean, the humanitarian, the solidarity aspects, and also behavioral changes in terms of recognizing environmental fragilities, etc. How can we make sure that these positive changes, these positive lessons learned are not lost and that they persist for after the crisis as well? I think these are some reflections for the post-crisis as well.
Thank you, Jutta. Thank you, Anita, very much. We move on with some other questions, and then we will collect further questions also from the public at the end. But our second question is actually closely related to some of the comments you just made. And in fact, it relates to your mentioning the fact that crises in critical times expose inequalities that affect societies, that they often exacerbate those inequalities disproportionately affecting vulnerable sectors and marginalized groups. In the COVID global pandemic, we have also witnessed different ways in which limitations have been established on the enjoyment of fundamental rights and freedoms, such as mobility, communication, and privacy. And at the same time, some authoritative but also authoritarian decisions have been imposed on entire societies. So as countries move into phase 2 or 3 or next phase of the crisis, the risk is to experience processes of normalization of both limitations of rights and justification of non-transparent and non-democratic mechanism of decision-taking and form of leadership. So in many contexts, we see that reaction emerge, not all of them grounded in democratic principles and values. But from a feminist perspective, and that clearly speaks to what Jutta just said in her last comment, we can also see that this reaction is a possibility to act in response or to act again, but differently. And so the question is, in your opinion, what would to act differently mean from a feminist leadership perspective? And how does this translate in local context? And how do you see this happening in practice?
Okay, thank you. Yes, from a feminist leadership perspective, to act differently, first of all, could mean to reflect and to critically question the status quo and to interrogate business as usual situations. So crisis situations create opportunities to question everything and to fix what does not work or is broken. We can see gaps and broken links in our system. And as I just mentioned already, the food system, for example, has made it very obvious that monoculture, large-scale production, for a global consumer is very fragile. So we can see those broken links in our system, and we can perceive better what works and what needs to be changed. So a feminist lens will direct our attention towards the injustices and the unfairness, social and environmental impacts which become obvious, and will demand a critical assessment of possible solutions or strategies. Maybe presenting new ways of how we can tackle these challenges. So to act differently also translates into being bold, exploring new ways of doing things, and to creatively transform our society. New opportunities evolve out of renewed actions, rupturing with established processes and ways that have shaped our society so far and that need change, which is obvious. Public health system, for example, I think in many countries it has shown the importance to have a well-functioning, grassroots embedded public health system, particularly in lower income countries. In practice, this means also organizing ourselves, connecting our networks on common ground ideas. And the current crisis has isolated us individually from our close social relations, particularly in those countries where the lockdown is enforced by police force, like it is the case in Kisumu, Kenya, for example. Very different to where I am in Victoria here. We're still allowed to go out, to walk, to be in nature with social distance. So there's big differences in how people are experiencing the crisis currently. However, we have this social isolation which is physically distancing us also from our work. Like, we're all working from home. Our children are not going to school. We're also taking care of the education of our children at home at this moment. So this has certainly shifted perspectives as well, and has given us opportunities and new burdens, of course, as well. And I would also say that many of us are also, despite that social isolation, are experiencing a heightened connectivity. Like this moment where we are in right now, we're talking with Anita from India and connecting to Padua, and maybe our listeners are from different places of the world, and this is something new. Of course, we have had webinars before, but the intensity, people are participating, and it is common people participating. I participated in a webinar where a waste picker, an autonomous waste picker in São Paulo, he was still working in the city with his cell phone. He participated in the webinar and he gave a testimony of what COVID meant for him and his work. So I think these are like the positive sides of the technology, which is allowing us to be connected and to get organized and to network, to participate in meetings. But participatory, what I think what most of us are aspiring for is a participatory democracy. But this still remains more of a theoretical concept rather than an everyday practice. Again, we can turn to waste management as an example to elucidate that situation. Waste pickers and their representatives are most often not taken into consideration when discussing local recycling programs, for example, and waste management in general. And yet they know more about how to handle waste and recyclables in particular than many other people. For sure, more than any politician or representative in a government agent. and yet they do not take part. They are not included in the decision making. So yeah, prejudice and stigma still remain the main challenges in creating spaces for dialogue among different knowledges, in this particular example. But I think it also applies to many of those who work in the informal sector, who are seen with prejudice and are socially and economically often excluded. So there is also still a significant barrier between academic and popular knowledge, I think, which still needs to be overcome. Most of the academic production never makes it actually into the grassroots. Publications, even to access academic publications, sometimes the cost does not allow a common person to download a paper, because not everything is put open access yet. So the communication channels prioritized by academia and the language used make it difficult to reach a broader public. So we need much better knowledge translation and dissemination from the academia to the grassroots. Too often knowledge is created in a top-down fashion without the inputs, without the additions and verification of popular knowledge. In community-based research and in participatory action research, we do research with people and not on people, and knowledge is co-created, providing opportunities for the emancipation of the participants through their own agency. However, CBR and participatory action research are not the mainstream. It's still being considered as the soft sciences, and in terms of receiving funding, it's harder to get funding for those types of research. So the coming together of different knowledges, and here I'm speaking about popular knowledge, indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledges, etc., is needed indeed, and it is feeding our hope to achieving a better understanding of the complex social and ecological systems we live in. So we do need to merge those knowledges so that we can have a more mindful and sustainable and more just interaction and actions. So applying, for example, applying precautionary principle and recognizing that each action generates a reaction, and making sure that gender equality is in place. So I think, yeah, that to me it encompasses what to act on means.
Thank you, Jutta. And very interestingly, in answering the question about how to act differently, you already anticipated some of the issues and comments that were part of a next question that was actually about knowledge and the different knowledges and the need for these knowledges to come together. So I take the opportunity to maybe invite Anita in her remark to address both issues. So on the one side, the question that remains, feminist leadership, what form it takes, what kind of possibility it has today. But on the other side, following feminist scholars that invite us to think about knowledge beyond borders. And there is two like suggestion that I like to mention here. On the one side, Donna Haraway recently in her work, Toulousine, she highlights the necessity of bringing together knowledges, possibly mentioning one knowledge that even us within academia who are concerned about how to make this knowledge that is produced within academia enter in dialogue with the practical knowledges, with civil society organizations. And she also mentions the artists. So beside the advocates and the activists, and that type of language is maybe something that we not always take enough into consideration. And on the other side, I like to recall here Paul Cow's who in the line and following the work of Mohanty, she reminds us that knowledge is achieved among knowers struggling together, but she invites us to think beyond what feminist thinking have done in the past, asking what knowledge, whose knowledge, and she's inviting us to think in terms of whom am I knowing with. So this whole point of the coming together that Jutta was just mentioning. So in that respect, I think we follow Jutta's comment, but then the question is what kind of translation? What kind of translation we need to make those knowledges actually speaking to each other and finding like new grounds. Anita, you have a huge question in front of you.
So the first thing is about what does it mean to act differently? Is there a feminist way of acting, you know? There always is, because I think there is hope, and there is hope for a new paradigm. But sadly, I love the optimism that Jutta brings, because she works with communities, and she's so spirited about the fact that the way speakers could come together and, you know, forge a participatory democracy. Just as a critical, you know, foil to that argument, I'd like to say that one thing that scares me is, other than the leftist-leaning publishing houses and, you know, the various magazines that I subscribe to, I do think that although there was a large criticism of why the world needs to stop and rethink its paradigm, I somehow think that once the lockdown is being lifted, everybody is going to business as usual. And so this entire thought process that needs to be given about the new paradigm is really not happening, except that I read something very interesting about the state of Hawaii. And the state of Hawaii has come up with a feminist recovery plan, you know, recovery plan coming out of the pandemic. The whole premise is this, that if you don't make a plan that is feminist, you're not going to have a neutral plan, because the default plan is going to be essentially patriarchal. So it's actually therefore extremely important to invest in creating a feminist plan. And Hawaii's feminist economic recovery plan includes very, very fascinating things. So one is publicly provided childcare for essential workers. So how will nurses go to the hospital if they're worried about their own family and children? The second is a hourly minimum wage, which is like a universal basic income for single mothers. So it's like an hourly minimum wage for single mothers. And the other thing which I found fascinating was that the plan calls for a reinvestment in midwifery services. So it goes back to traditional knowledge in some ways, legitimizes it, and says, let's not make a pathology out of pregnancy, you know, let's train our midwives and bring them back into public life. Now let's compare this with the European Union's roadmap to recovery, which was written in April. And when I read it the first time, I almost wanted to laugh, except that this is like a tragic comedy, you know, one of those serials on Netflix, which is like a tragic comedy. So its introduction, you know, reads like this, that the roadmap to recovery must allow Europe to make the most of the first mover advantage in the global race to recovery. So, you know, we talk about collaboration, cooperation. Why should the recovery be a race? I really don't understand that. You know, you're on a race to recover, you know, and Europe needs a first mover advantage. So somebody evidently who is not feminist took a shot at writing this plan. So what I want to really do is analyze if there's something essentially feminist about doing things differently, you know. Is there such a thing as a feminist way of looking at the world? Are women actually given to thinking in a feminist way? Obviously not, right? Because there may be certain correlations, but we have to really understand what happens. Last week in Open Democracy, Italian and Irish scholars, a team of people, about 4 or 5 people, using data from the World Bank and from the European Commission, put together the responses of countries to the pandemic, comparing how countries with female leaders have fared compared to how countries with male leaders have fared. And they concluded that countries with female leaders have suffered 1/6 as many COVID deaths as those led by men. The chances of survival in a female-led democracy is 6-1 compared to a male-led democracy. So the research also shows that because of the various policies that these female leaders have adopted before the pandemic, in terms of their social budgets, in terms of their environmental policies, these countries are going to suffer the least from the ensuing economic recession, and they're going to experience a decline in the GDP, which is just 5.5% compared to a bigger percentage in men-led economies. Now, this points to some interesting hypotheses. The approach to the crisis, and closer home where I live, is the state of Kerala, where the minister is a woman, the health minister is a woman. And she's been on, different celebrity magazine covers in the past month. And she's been going around the business of, rehabilitation and treatment in the most no-nonsense manner. And what actually is very clear is women are not afraid of failure. They do not care that they will fail, that they will fall. So that's one very important thing, that in public life, male leaders, especially male fascist leaders, have a very fragile ego. They cannot bear to see a wrong Twitter go out. And if that happens, then they are immediately, their office is jumping up and issuing another Twitter to clarify the previous one. Or they're going on a call with, Jack Dorsey or somebody and saying, please pull it down. So the whole idea of a feminist way of doing things is to really do things in consultation, have a decentralized setup so that there are many leaders looking at things, and have a whole lot of transparency about things. That you bring to the table the facts that these are apples, these are oranges, and we are doing our best. So there is that ability to actually look at longer term and shorter term well-being together. So there is no essentialism here. What we need to do is we need to look at the sociological and cultural aspects that make women who they are, that make women bring certain perspectives to the table. But we also have to look at the fact that their ways of being and doing have been part of a hierarchy of worldviews which has repressed the way women think and articulate. Women build perspectives. So there is a certain dialectic, and we should actually understand these dialectics between the structural opportunities that women get in the form of democracy and the way in which they bring in their agency through their own life experiences can actually come together to create unique ways of framing issues and responding to issues. I'd like to actually quote Arundhati Roy, who just recently wrote about the pandemic. And she says that our task is to imagine how leadership can be humane. And she says, and I quote, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal. It's a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, our dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through it lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Actually, the question is, despite all these webinars and despite all these kinds of narratives in the public domain, where is the political power and where is the political conviction to make this transition happen? And that brings me to the question of knowledges. Who are we listening to and who are we thinking along with, and who is listening to whom, and who does have the power to execute and make actions possible? I read this recently, and it's about a cartoon in the New Yorker. So just imagine a group of people is sitting in rags, completely tattered clothes around a fire, and the ruins of a civilization is in the background. So the earth has been destroyed and this group is sitting. And so somebody says, yes, the planet got destroyed. And then he says, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So the whole thing is that we go round and round and round through moments of crisis. 2008, we had a crisis, then we had Snowden revelations, then we had the Cambridge Analytica, then we had quite a few disasters in different countries. We had political fallouts today in Israel, to Hungary, to India, to US. We have fascist governments. Even then, we are really not able to let go of this kind of a neoliberal capitalist worldview. And I think that knowledge practices that are in the margins really need to be put center stage. Common sense has been under siege for decades now. We are told that ideas of value are about the GDP. So what is to be valued is not women's labor, not the thoughts that children and young people can bring to the table. That's not valuable. What's valuable is GDP. And the idea of participation is about having an Instagram account, right? So we need to actually destabilize all of this and create different kinds of communicative environments. Women who are not visible, women in rural communities, trans women, older women, women farmers, women from minority religions will be the linchpin to rebuild societies. Not the women who are upper class, not the women who are sitting in universities. I think it's women who are invisible. And the nature of the 21st century publics is extremely harsh. Online spaces are misogynistic and they are completely institutional fallow lands controlled by new feudal lords. Think Facebook, think Twitter, think all these spaces and, whose voices are heard. And narrow identitarian politics have polarized women in public life. And in countries like mine, students have been attacked time and again. And this has created a chilling effect. So we really need strong penalties for sexism in public life. We need civic penalties. And I urge all of us to set up a project where we can create a repository of institutional memory of all the public instances that push women back, the troll armies, the statements made by our ministers. In Malaysia, the ministers came out and said, women, go home, use makeup on your faces so that you can look beautiful so that the men don't feel tired. So these are official statements made by the political, people in power. So I think that we also need to create safer cities, but safety now does not only mean physical security. It means the rights to exercise our right to dissent, because the right to dissent has been completely taken away. And so the Black Lives Matter movements have been asking these questions, but we have to ask this and problematize it much more. Which are those invisible bodies we must recover in the fight against fascism? Campuses are very crucial for multiple knowledges. Our educational curricula must change. And I think I would like to believe that feminists of all genders need to step up, not just feminists, who are women, but feminists of all genders. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have looked at bodies, at the body politic, biopolitics and necropolitics in Achille Mbembe's own meaning of the word. We have looked at the vulnerable and vulnerability, and how some way of feminist leadership may intervene in this crisis of both bodies and institutions and nations and states and globally. And it has been very interesting to think through reactions with Jutta and Anita. And these reactions are taking both the present and the future into account. And this leads me to the last question, which starts a bit historically by looking at the trajectory of women's struggles, which is a long history of struggles, which has also been slow in its results, in getting the empowerment that women have been looking for through history in different parts of the world, and women are still struggling. And this history tells us that the place and role of women in society as legitimate and equal is not yet a given, not everywhere at least. and has not been naturalized in the good sense of the word, nor has it really altered the power relations between women and men. In fact, one wonders whether a new form of cultural hegemony may be needed so as to disseminate, share values that would support alternative forms of leadership. I'm being a little Gramscian here, and Antonio Gramsci argued that the consent that will produce cultural hegemony is achieved by the spread of beliefs, assumptions, values, through social institutions such as schools, churches, universities, courts, the media, among others. And he said, they are these institutions that do the work of socializing people into norms, values, and beliefs. So that is where new forms of leadership would also come to be accepted as normal. Now, from what you say, from what you have just said, this may not be the case. So we should shift probably gaze from what we think of as state structures to other positions, situations, other kind of people, the margins, as Anita said, the vulnerable, the waste pickers that Jutta spoke about. But I'm just asking because that is connects to the question of that Anita asked. Now, where is the political power that we need for this transition? You know, to build a different future. So my last question to you is composite. I would ask you whether what is needed today is in fact a new cultural hegemony, and if so, what language do we need to define it in relation, for instance, to this word that I mentioned in the beginning, dependence, forms of dependence, and that we could reframe, reshape as perhaps interdependence, transdependence, codependence, independence. We could play with words to provide not only new meaning, but new actions and new visions. So what forms of dependence would allow for a transformation?
I agree that a revolution towards transformative change proposed by women's struggles for empowerment since long is very required and aspired. I think that's what we're working towards and hope to see change happening. But if we call this shift a new cultural hegemony, we need to recognize that the term hegemony means dominance and control over, which also has negative sides, particularly, well, regarding political, economic, and ethical ideas of society as a whole. And I am skeptical and scared about dominance. I don't know, I remember Margaret Thatcher. She's definitely not a feminist, but she was a woman. So I would like to see more women in power, for sure. Women need to be in power, and we see the difference women make when they are in power. Anita has given the example in terms of COVID victims in countries led by women, being much lower than countries led by men. Similar here in Victoria, in the province I live, in British Columbia, our health minister, the woman, she is the best in terms of communicating, gaining trust, and taking sensible decisions. So we have many, many examples. We don't even have to go far to look for these examples. So I would like to see more women in power, running governments, having a say in decision-making, controlling assets, shaping role models, spreading equal rights and justice. I would rather propose a counter-hegemonic perspective as a bottom-up, inclusive and participatory democratic process, as a grassroots cultural revolution instead of a hegemonic dominance of one powerful group or idea of society. So more women in power can make a change, and we see that. A paradigm shift, however, is required, and changing people's behavior, eradicate prejudice against women, amongst vulnerable populations, amongst the informal sector, etc. Misconceived ideas and ideologies. These need to be questioned and changed, and so that we can have a more just society. So I would suggest that we use the word codependence, because we are all depending on each other and on the environment, on nature. I think that is very, very key. I think that's all I would like to say.
My thoughts are somewhat similar, and so I'll keep it very short. I think Gramscian thought has a lot of relevance, not only because of his thesis on culture with a small c and counterculture, but also because his own thoughts were built on the need to combine cultural power with other kinds of power. So the fight for cultural hegemony had to be part of an overall strategy that also incorporated struggles for political and economic power. So he started by being a Marxist, and then when he was, incarcerated, he really didn't. He found that economic and political power were inadequate, and therefore he said culture is also important, but that doesn't negate the need for a class struggle. So I think we need a tremendous overhaul of our systems, and no interdependence or codependence is plausible unless we're able to acknowledge the huge distrust in societies and polities and the brutal cultures of disempowerment that disenfranchise the majority. So I think we can't even begin. I mean, I look around me, my neighbors, and we have this wonderful feminist representative of my constituency in the Legislative Assembly, and she's a young woman who was the first one to tweet out and say, please do not abandon your pets because pets don't carry COVID. She is a woman who got married in a completely green wedding where she didn't have any plastic. And the neighborhood boys said that, you know what, she's been doing social distancing since she was elected to power. And it's so cruel because the way in which women are pushed back, is very, very harsh. And I do think that just like Jutta pointed out about her own minister in her own state, I also feel that there are women all around us who are great examples. From the field, I do see that one thing that women practice is the idea of collectives, being in collectives. Sometimes they practice farming in collectives because they're so poor that they don't own a patch of land. They rent a patch of land. They put in their labor, and these are solidarity economies in the grassroots. And I think we need to rethink our economic paradigm, put power formally in the hands of women through, constitutional changes, reform our electoral system and its financing, and create a new globalism like this one of ideas and actions that's interconnected and federated through multiple networks of the local. And I do think that an important aspect of the interdependence that women from the grassroots teach us, and certainly women from rural areas teach us, is about their links with nature. And the fact that the solidarity they talk about is a solidarity that is about planet and people and life worlds and knowledge and all of that being in a different kind of space-time relationship than has been constructed by authoritarian capitalism. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a provocative question. I'm glad it didn't put you off. And The answers are very forceful, very strong. We need cooperation, codependence, an acknowledgement of the fact that contrary to widespread prejudice, women do work well in team. They do work well in collectives, and that is where a new strength may come from. Now I would like to ask Claudia whether she wants to say something, or whether or Sarah, if you want to say something, or whether we just jump to the Q&A session.
The Q&A session actually starts with some questions that have been elaborated by students who've taken part in the World Social Agenda project that Sarah described before. And I think it fits very nicely with the last comments that Anita was making, speaking about multiple networks of the local, because students have really been looking at their daily life, their daily environment, trying to find out the basic elements of what is our understanding of gender relation in those contexts. So they have developed, elaborated some questions in their own terms, in their own words. And I think Francesca has those questions.
I have the questions from the Primo Liceo Curiel. So these are students from the first grade of high school. And they say that, yes, as Claudia said, that their questions are very much based on research which they carried out in their own settings. And they said that one of this, a common stereotype is that boys are better in scientific subjects and girls more in humanistic subjects. But on the basis of the research that they carried out within their class, they found that many of the students didn't agree with this. So they don't share this belief, this common stereotype. And so they ask themselves, how come these stereotypes exist and where are they born? Why are boys supposed to be believed to be better at science subjects? And then the second class from the Liceo Fermi, they say when dealing with the theme of gender and school, some questions which they want to know, different perspectives have been raised. So they talked to a primary school teacher who said to them that it's not only the school that affects the boys and girls, but the environment surrounding them, namely the family. So how much should the family and school do to help children grow up without prejudice to the issue, to equal opportunities? And then also talking to university professors, however, they found that men and women can make different contributions to science, research, or innovation. And so they would like to know, and in part, I think you've answered this, what, in particular, what male and female contributions can be made in the university field. Are there real gender differences as regards intelligence or the ability to solve gender problems? Or are they something seemingly determined by mankind?
I think it's a question that all of us, it's like a rite of passage. We all grow up asking ourselves, is there something different about the way the brains of men and women are engineered? And we go to our, I think, we perhaps take that question with us when we die, because I think the straightforward answer to that is just as much as gender is part of the socialized way by which we grow up, there also has been enough that shows that exposure to different opportunities does make men and women really equal. I mean, the kinds of things that men do, women can easily do. So you're right that when you actually ask this question, your teachers actually said that the prejudice is dependent on the way by which our schools, our families, our neighborhoods actually puts thoughts into our head. What is important is when you talk to scientists today, there is a rhetoric of diversity. If you actually look at corporations, they say it's important to have diverse people in the workplace because they bring diverse skill sets. That helps capitalism. I think that's not really the concern. The concern is really that scientific establishments, university spaces have been spaces of power, and spaces of power always have had gatekeeping. in the history of science, there have been many experiments done by women scientists that have actually gone in the names of their men. And it's really important to acknowledge that this entire business about what is valued, who is visible, all of this is tied to the way institutions construct power. I know that sounds a bit abstract, but that's the way things actually work. I therefore actually want to say that our brains are not going to be wired so differently that you can contribute a pink telephone and design very differently. But yes, from the standpoint of how we look at the world critically in different ways, for instance, how a Black person might look at things, how a disabled person might look at things, how a trans person might look at things, there is something to be done about making societies equitable that has a place for everybody's perspective. And that's how I think we should program for difference.
In that same line, I would also, I see it as mainly a stereotype in terms of deciding that boys are good at this and girls are good at that. I think these are stereotype and prejudices built on our system, on our social system. And I think it becomes reiterated through the media, through advertisement, where gender roles are cemented and where these differences are put forward as girls being not fit for the sciences, for example. And I think this is also changing. If we look at enrollments in engineering or in science courses nowadays compared to 20 years ago, we see a much larger enrollment of women in those subjects. And so I think, as Anita was also saying, I think it is the powers, it serves our existing power structures to have women kind of shuffled into certain areas only, which are of less access to power. And yeah, so I think it is our system which shapes these gender roles. This happens at school, and it happens through the interactions in our daily life. It happens by exposing our children to videos and the messages which are out there communicated on television and through the cell phones and whatever. So I would say, in principle, there is no difference. A girl can study the same topics as a boy can. I think boys and girls are equally intelligent.
Thank you. Another two questions again. Second B, again, Liceo Fermi addresses the issue of work, an important topic for the future of young people. They were asking themselves whether there are ways of support that the government gives to support women's work and gender equality outside Italy. And here you did speak a lot about women leaders and the differences in those countries, but if you have anything to add to that. And they gave the example of the work-life balance project that we have in Europe, and they wanted to know if there are similar projects in your countries and how they're developed. And then Terza C of the Liceo Curiel again. Their research consisted in trying to find gender differences in multiple places and scenarios. And they went across some of them which now seem normal, but then they realized that they shouldn't be ordinary. That they just accept these because, you know, they have been in place for many years. And then they question themselves, perhaps our research was focused on the Italian scenario, but they're interested in, from an outsider's point of view, do you believe Italy is working enough on issues regarding gender differences? What could we do better? And what countries could we look up to?
Well, I can't speak to the case of Italy, but I can speak more generally what I see, for example, in the case of Canada and other countries I interact with. Gender differences persist, gender inequalities persist, and they have to be worked on. And like in my university, there was, until very recently, there was a very big gender gap in terms of payment. Women were notorically being paid less than men. And so a commission has been struck to look at this issue, and repairments have been done to this. This is like maybe just the tip of the iceberg in terms of gender differences being addressed. But so I think these issues, they exist everywhere, even in countries like Sweden, I would say, which are very advanced in terms of having more just society. But these issues, they need to be addressed, and we need to work with them.
Let me begin with the second question first. The idea of whether the Italian context is something that can be commented upon from the outside. I think even without knowing a society, one can easily say that modernity and the post-industrial societies, have somehow gotten into a particular form of social and economic organization that have created institutions of the family and the social contract with the state, all of which are based with a certain silent gender contract that the household will be looked after by the woman. This is a kind of a patriarchal bargain, which is not really a policy document, but it's a kind of a silent social agreement, between the men in power, men in communities, and men in the household, that all said and done, the care work, the work of cleaning up will be done by women. So I have Italian friends, and they tell me that their men in general, in politics, in society, are very hypermasculine. They are not really feminist. So I can say from the outside, and also as a political observer, that the nature of politics and the nature of public trust we have in our institutions as women in India or in Italy is rather low. We don't really necessarily trust our governments to do the right thing, even if on paper they say all the right things. So that brings me to the idea of where we are in a country like India with respect to the policies for women. Of course, all countries do have a Ministry of Women. They do, this is all part of the way in which, post-World War II, the way in which we've actually managed to build our bureaucracies. But I have to say one very important thing. In India, 90% of women work in what's called the informal sector. The informal sector is a space where you really don't have a contract. Your labor rights are not protected. And after the pandemic, in fact, labor rights have been further deregulated. There's been a context of labor reform, which means in order to allow industries to come and step in so that the recession does not hit people very badly, the recession does not hit the economy very badly, labor laws have been diluted, which actually means that people are allowed to employ people for as long as 12 hours in a factory per shift without a break. They don't get leave, and they lose their pay if they take leave. About 80% of our economy still depends, 70 to 80% depends on farmlands. And these are all very, very small farms, like 1 acre, and you barely grow enough to sustain yourself. So we're talking about a situation where the long arm of policy, the long arm of the state doesn't even reach. So it's a very, very chaotic situation, a situation where there's high precarity. And, in Europe, there's a joke that we always do, in our research, that Europe discovered the gig economy only when Uber drivers started driving, but the gig economy always existed where we come from. That's the nature of the game.
Now a question has come from Julia, who's a student in work and social psychology at the University of Padua, and she's about to graduate. Her thesis work is focused on gender role stereotypes and gender disproportion in employment. If stereotypes led us to think that men are more competent than women, how do you think it could be possible to give women equal job opportunities in terms of access to the workplace? And as a consequence, how could women reach leadership and higher status positions if they're hindered at the start? How can we change this paradigm based on masculine features? Thank you.
Well, I think we need policies to stimulate and to facilitate women access to to study and access to workplaces, and for example, providing more spaces and scholarships for women to access the education, and but also I think we need to communicate better, and we need to put out the research results and make a stronger voice on equality, and so that women are seen as equal and have the same chances as men.
If I may add something there, I would also suggest that we should make knowledge more hospitable. And when I say that, I think of, for example, our courses here at the University of Padua that we are trying now to make more accessible, more appealing, also in terms of what they offer, in terms of in what language they speak, that would be relevant to a girl who wants to do science or technology or mathematics, or the kind of studies that would give her proper job in the future, maybe, or allow her to change the world in ways that perhaps are not so easily changing the world now. So we do need, on the one hand, a different language for science, a different language for knowledge, and also gendered knowledges. That is the production of kind of knowledge that take gender as a variable into account. And the idea, for example, of gendered innovations that we are trying to promote at the University of Padua is also part of this. The fact that research is not neutral, knowledge is never been neutral. The way you communicate knowledge, when you share knowledge, is not neutral. It needs to. This needs to be understood by ourselves as researchers and teachers, but also by institutions in general, because otherwise I think that those differences will never ever be considered as a value rather than a hindrance. Those differences that we were talking about, gender differences, we're all different, but each one has to have or find a place in this world, also in the world of knowledge. So this is a major change, I think, that is required of schools, of universities, of places where knowledge is produced.
There aren't any more questions, but I have a question. In terms of IT and technology, so now we are forced out of the classroom, well, in some contexts more than others, and there is a kind of great hatred of technology. So it's allowing us to create these connections. And Jutta, you mentioned a couple of ways in which, waste workers were able to connect to a meeting. But there's also, Anita, you mentioned, surveillance technology, algorithms. We all keep hearing about artificial intelligence, data analytics, MOOCs, all these kind of negative uses of technology. But you talk, or at least your name on this Zoom is IT for Change. And I'd really like to hear from you about how we can, is it a gendered use of IT for change, but positive uses of technology? I'm really interested in hearing more in terms of moving for the future. How can we really push for this and push away from these surveillance society and surveillance education as well?
Yeah, I think that feminist perspectives of technology behoove us, exhort us to looking at technology not really as something extraneous to society, but as part of that recursive process by which technology shapes human beings and how human beings can, as agents, act upon technology. So in a sense, I think what technology represents today to us is a creation of human agency, and it doesn't have to be so. By this, I don't mean that technology is neutral. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that the values that we imbibe technological processes with, for instance, you could actually use a database to create an open library, and the code that uses, the code that creates that repository, which is open as a library, is the very same code that could actually be something that manipulates society. So I do think that we are just about beginning to understand how data can be used. I think there is a lot that is possible in the state of Kerala, which is our neighboring state, where I was talking about the female minister who did a fabulous job. That state has actually started using participatory geomapping, location mapping for disaster preparedness, because the state faced floods, it faced different kinds of natural disasters, and it decided that for people to know where their different public infrastructure points are, it's important to activate civic communities, it's important to activate local governments to start geotagging different public infrastructures. Of course, the government did step in to create the kind of standards that are necessary for permissions so that, the data is not hacked, etc. So there are ways by which, again, I think a very famous example is about the cities of Barcelona and Amsterdam. The ways by which participatory democracy platforms are created in those cities for a new kind of urbanism, where people can actually participate in direct democracy, in fluid democracy, so that they feel that they decide whether a garden should come in here, a park should come in here, a children's creche facility should come in here, a childcare facility. So there is actually a possibility to engineer these structures, provided we kind of lay the foundations of the principles and the values that technology will be used for in society at large. I think today there's a huge vacuum. There's a kind of an institutional vacuum, and people have been talking about autonomous weapons. What if, one country pulls the plug and there's this kind of AI-based warfare? We do need multilateralism. We need a healthy dialogue across nations in order to create a new kinds of human rights basis. We have to reinterpret human rights in the age of data and the digital technologies. And I think that feminist methods of appropriation of these technologies tells us a lot about the alternative values through which new forms of relationships can be built between human societies and technologies.
Thank you very much for mentioning this. I think it really speaks, it's meaningful to some of the students who are still in the class, who are actually students from the master's degree in European and Global Studies. Because one of the things that we did in our course this year was to engage in a partnership on digital constitutionalism with other students from other universities. And we were basically addressing the foundation of what you're speaking about. So I think what you just said in terms of the possible application of knowing the principles and having as a guideline human rights as a base is an example of the kind of knowledge we develop within the university, even if you're exposed to apparently abstract understanding, but coming to learn about all these efforts and all these initiatives to establish charters and declarations that refer to those basic fundamental rights and freedoms, and then how going into the world in your different occupation and different job opportunities, you can bring that knowledge with you and translate that into examples like the one that you showed to us. So this is, it's a very nice way of maybe coming towards the end of a conversation where we've had, the experience of students from high school, our own students from the university, your own perspective from quite different places, but also with the broad global outlook. So in my view, this has been very rich, and I sense we have a long research agenda to address if, as the Elena Cornaro Center for Gender Studies, we want to, as we will, carry forward this conversation. So Annalisa, maybe a last word from you before we close.
I agree, it's been very rich. The viewpoints do not always coincide, but they speak to one another very precisely. And I do thank you for taking all the time to think through and share your answers with us. Now, what do we do here? We look ahead to a time next autumn when we will meet again in a new conversation. It would be great if other people could join this conversation, and also it would be great if we could have a conversation around a table, a real table. Although I understand it won't be so easy in the next few months. But really, I do believe in inviting us all, the students that have been with us, you in your work, the people of the Cornaro Center, women who have been finding this crisis particularly tough. My invitation is that we should believe in the right to a firm life, decent work, equal participation in the economy, in society, in politics, and that we should pay attention, a lot of attention, to the environment and the generations that come after us. And we should cultivate a different gaze and different words in order to produce new paradigm for public life, where everyone is dependent on everyone else, where all are feminists in spite of their gender, and where the vulnerable and the voiceless and women will have a place. This is a wonderful, wonderful vision, I think. There's more questions and answers, but there are answers that have come from you, for which I do thank you deeply, and I hope we speak again. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. We share that vision.
Thank you.
Bye.
So see you again. See you all again.